Good morning. This is Kenneth and Bailey here with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you a quick recap on what went down last night at the Minneapolis Public School Board meeting. Bailey, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good, doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Bailey and I did not actually get the chance to be in the boardroom last night because it was apparently packed. And by the time we tried to reserve a spot in there, tickets were sold out. And so we both got a chance to watch it at home, which, you know, wish we could have been in the room, but also like not the worst trade-off in the world to watch it on your couch and not have to drive home after. But before we get all the way into that, I do want to have you, Bailey, introduce yourself. We're so excited for Bailey to be the newest member of our AEC team. And so, Bailey, do you want to tell people a little bit about your background and your role?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's nice to meet you all. My name is Bailey. I joined the AEC team pretty recently, maybe 2 months ago at this point. I don't know, time doesn't really exist in many ways in the pandemic for me, so it's hard to say. But yeah, I'm really excited to start in this new role, focusing on policy and research. We have a lot of really exciting projects coming up, and I'm excited to get started on them. But a little bit about me and my background is I finished graduate school back in May. I was at the Humphrey School and did a degree in human rights public policy, and got some really great opportunities there. One of my favorite projects was working with the United Nations with the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, which was really, really cool. And then before my time in graduate school, I was working with the Minnesota Youth Council and Solutions Not Suspensions Coalition. So I've been in the education space and for a couple of years now in various places, but it's really exciting to me to be at AEC to focus on one school district and to be able to really build deep relationships with folks and be able to make some really meaningful, impactful change. So I'm really excited to be a part of the team, and yeah, it's great to meet you all.
Cool. Well, we're really excited to have you, Bailey, and we are throwing you in the deep end real quick here to have you step in for Heather, who is spending some time with family. And so, yeah, Bailey and I got to watch the school board meeting last night. And so Bailey's gonna do a legendary Heather rundown of last night's board meeting. So, Bailey, you want to go for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Heather, I will try to do you justice, but go easy on me. So last night at this board meeting, just for context, it was about 3.5 hours or so. So a little bit of a longer one. And a lot of things were covered in that time frame. A lot of people know this annual meeting as the Truth in Taxation meeting. I saw it at a lot of other board meetings across other districts last night too. So basically, the hearing was a chance to talk about a property tax increase for property owners across Minneapolis. And there were some folks that came in at public comment time to speak on that as well. After the taxation piece of the public comment, we heard a lot from just general public commenters. And specifically, there are kind of three main themes from those commenters. And the first one was regarding the contract with the superintendent, and some folks were asking for a one-year contract that focused on academic metrics to have accountability going forward on that, around literacy specifically. Additionally, there were some ESPs sharing their stories and asking for an increase in salary and to cap class sizes. And then the last main group of folks that were sharing their experiences were talking about the boundary change for North High, and talking about some students not being able to attend their community and generational school anymore. So after the public comment period, the superintendent shared an update on the school calendar, and specifically the use of e-learning days and how it interacts with snow days, and also just the start and end time of the general calendar year. So that ended up being a decently long discussion, I thought, about when should we start school and how that interacts with professional development. And again, those snow days, e-learning days, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and then we went into a big time period of kind of the nitty gritty details of the operations. So that included a lot of budget pieces, a lot of just detailed logistics. And so the first presentation was an audit of the district's finances, and um, everything looks pretty good. We got like a healthy rating, so that's a good sign. After that, we heard a little bit about the budget process and where things are at. Um, and then next was the pro forma, which is basically the district's projection of next year's budget projections for the next year. And if that is of interest of you, I really recommend to go into MPS's website and dig into that. I think it's a really well done document and helps lay out things really clearly. And something with the pro forma that stood out to me is that enrollment is a conversation to be having, and how that fits into, budget and everything else going forward. And then we heard about the legislative agenda. The legislative session in Minnesota is getting started in just a few weeks already, so kind of preparing for that. And then lastly, budget priorities for this next year were shared. And that kind of wrapped up the meaty, deep details of all those district pieces with presentations. And then the last bit of the meeting was focusing on two things, one of which we are pretty excited about. There's a memorandum of understanding with the American Indian group. And so that was approved last night. And then the second thing that was approved was the tax levy for up to a little over 7% for homeowners or property owners in Minneapolis. So lots and lots of things were covered last night. We'll be digging into it more in just a little bit, but I hope my first time with the recap went well, and I'll pass it back over to Kenneth.
Yes. Excellent job, Bailey. Yeah, and this was not an easy meeting to do a recap of. So I thought you did well standing in for Heather here. But switching into slide of the night, I want to actually elevate a document, not a slide, but I think this is a pretty important document for folks to be aware of. So this is the document that was talked about, just touched on, honestly, last night, that directors Ellison, Arneson, and Caprini put together to suggest budget priorities for the upcoming year. And so you can see this list of what looks like about 10, 11, 12 budget priorities and values that they want the finance team and school administration or district administration to really be prioritizing and focusing on. And you can see things here like predictable staffing, teacher equity plans, strategies to recruit and retain staff of color, school climate framework, all these different things. And so we wanted to make sure you all are aware of this document as well as the pro forma, because the board did not vote on this last night. They are going to vote on it next month. And so if there are things here that you think should be prioritized, let your school board members know. But also if there are other things that aren't on this list that you think should be prioritized, or if you think the list should be smaller and there should be only a few priorities, let your school board members know, because this conversation is a very important conversation and is foundational to the board's budget that they will approve in June of 2022. So wanted to make sure folks were aware of this, because it's a super important conversation. Bailey, is there anything on here that really stands out to you, or that you thought was interesting from last night's conversation?
Let's see here. I think this wasn't necessarily talked about last night. Perhaps some public commenters brought it up, but the bullet point that's fourth from the bottom that says strategies to recruit and retain staff, especially teachers of color, was of interest to me, especially as it related to the larger budget conversation.
Cool. Yeah. So I think this is interesting. The recommendations for the facility names advisory committee, because I know that there are a couple of schools that have already started or have already shared some of their name changes. I think I saw Jefferson will be changing their name to, I believe, Ella Baker, which I think is um, an interesting shift and change. And so it'll be interesting to see next year also what other names come out, which I think is really exciting and reflects some of the values of our schools and our communities. But with that, we're at our favorite section. And so we're going to throw Bailey again into the deep end and put her on the spot to share what was your most valuable moment from last night's school board meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. For me, my most valuable moment of the school board meeting was in the first chunk of the meeting. There was public comment, as we mentioned earlier, first with focusing on the tax levy, but then after that, more general public comment. And we heard from, I believe it was an 8th grader who came up and read off and shared their experiences about what school is like for them right now. And as someone who used to work with high school students, I think that is one of the most powerful things to hear directly from those who are experiencing the systems and programs that us adults are putting together. And I believe that was the only young person that spoke last night. And so for me, that was a breath of fresh air. And I really appreciated that, they probably had a lot of other things going on, like homework and just jobs and keeping up with life, and they decided to spend their time sharing with policymakers to try to make a change. And so I just wanted to shout out to that young person who was there and shared their experiences. So that was my most valuable moment from yesterday's meeting.
Yeah, definitely the most powerful moment, or one of the most powerful moments from last night's board meeting. I'd say for me, my most valuable moment, if I can't pick that one, is the board approving the memorandum of agreement with the urban Indian Ed directors to support the pathway schools and some of the work that Indian Ed is doing with the American Indian community here in Minneapolis, and on behalf of our American Indian students. So I thought that was a really important conversation. If you don't know much about the memorandum of agreement, you should check out our previous video that I did with Kelly Drummer, who's the executive director of MIGAZ, where we talked a little bit about the memorandum and what that means and what's changed and how it's going to be supportive of our American Indian students and our Indigenous population. So I thought that was a great moment. It was kind of quick because there was no discussion. It was a very fast thing, and they approved it without any disturbance or any kind of grandstanding. So I thought that was also good. And also they weren't trying to politicize something that is desperately needed for our Indigenous students. So yeah, so I will let you go first, Bailey, for your do better moment, just so that you're not the last voice that shares something negative. But what was your do better moment from last night's board meeting?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So as I mentioned earlier, last night's board meeting had a lot of different pieces in it. There was a lot of things to potentially focus on or miss or not really understand. And so for me, I think my do better moment is a more broad do better moment versus something, really specific or to a comment or whatever. But for me, I noticed there was a pretty big dissonance between the first half of the meeting and the second half of the meeting. Something I noticed was the first half of the meeting where, there's a lot of public comment on the truth in taxation, but then general comment period. There was a lot of urgency brought by the commenters. There was a lot of trying to explain just the daily grind and the daily experiences of, we heard from students, we heard from ESPs, we heard from a couple teachers, parents, community members, and from all those angles, there was, just a really strong sense of urgency that something needs to change, that we need to start doing things differently. And then the second half of the meeting felt very mundane, I guess. I'm not sure if that's the word I'm looking for, but it was just a stark contrast, between, the first and the second part of the meeting, where it seemed more business as usual.
Yeah.
It seemed more through the motions. And that's not to say budgeting is not important. It's incredibly important. But it didn't seem that what we were talking about for those pieces matched with what people are saying the needs are, and highlighting the urgency of those needs. So I think my do better moment is to have those be more consistent across the board, and to basically have what may seem like the more humdrum part of the meetings to reflect what people are saying the needs and the urgencies are.
Cool. Yeah, I think that was really apparent that it was just like there was clearly like a first half of a meeting and a second half of a meeting. The first half of the meeting, there's a lot of urgency and emotion, and the second half of the meeting, there was not that, when our board members were discussing the budget and like investments that are important for students and families. So yeah, I definitely felt that. And I think that was definitely a letdown and disappointing as we watched the meeting. But my do better moment is something that I think I might have shared actually last year as a do better moment. So, at least I'm consistent, but I think it's a problem that it's still not being addressed. Every year when we have this budget conversation, Minneapolis Public Schools and the finance team shares that our current cost structure, the way that our budget is set up, is not sustainable, essentially, because of all of the costs that we're incurring and the projected revenue that we're spending, and it's not supporting students. It's not working for us. But for some reason, our board, who is financially responsible for this district, never asks a question about what we can do to change that, what we have to do in order to change that reality. And I've seen finance staff over and over again try to emphasize like, hey, this is a bullet point that you need to pay attention to, that like our budget is not, where it needs to be. Like the way that we're currently structuring things, we're like making it work because we're making it work, but like we need to see some like foundational changes. And so when you see the budget values and the priorities that, directors Ellison, Arneson, and Caprini put forward, and then you see this, this slide or this topic be brought up by the finance team, but there's no conversation around what needs to change, that feels like a really big tension. And then it just feels like at the same time in this meeting every year, you just hear the district complain about the state not giving them money, which again is an important thing. Special education, severely underfunded. Multilingual education, severely underfunded. And at the same time, the district's not doing anything different to address their resources and how that's being spent either. And so my do better moment, again, for at least the second year in a row, is the fact that this board is refusing to ask hard questions of the jobs that they need to do in order to better support our students financially. And what is their responsibility to be better stewards of the resources that is given to them by, property taxpayers and Minnesota taxpayers in general, because it's a real problem and we have to do something different, clearly. And the board and the district administration can only keep saying that over and over and over again. But the board seems to ignore it, or doesn't seem to see that like the house is on fire and we need to do something different. Despite our healthy audits, despite all of the work that the finance team does to make it work, but again, you can only make it work to a certain point. So that's my do better moment, and clearly I'm fired up about it. So we might talk about it in our debrief video. But Bailey, I thought you did excellent job standing in for Heather. thank you for doing this recap with me. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye.